Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And telling the truth, during the previous 12 hours we got a lots of crazy updates that I don't understand and I would like to point to your attention. First, let's talk about Kiev, because during the previous 12 hours Zelensky made lots of very interesting statements. Let's discuss them in details. I just heard President Trump's statement. Very important words. I supported President Trump with the idea of direct talks with Putin. I openly said that I am ready for the meeting. I will be in Turkey. I hope that the Russians will not avoid this meeting. And of course, all of us in Ukraine would like President Trump to be able to be there with us at this meeting in Turkey. That was stated by Zelensky. Later, we got additional clarification, and according to information we have, Zelensky will not meet with anyone else in Istanbul except Putin. This was stated by the advisor of the head of his office, Podolyak. So this is something like a final discussion, final talks between Russia and Ukraine. At least the Ukrainian sources are trying to show everything like this. Let's discuss several statements that were made by the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump. He commented the situation and he commented the idea of Putin to start talks, direct talks in Istanbul. Trump said he is considering flying to Istanbul, where a meeting between Russian and Ukrainian officials could take place. He believes that Putin and Zelensky will meet in Istanbul. He also said that he thinks Russia will agree to a 30-day ceasefire. So now let's try to understand what is happening right now. And first of all, and we need to understand this clearly, that talks between the President of the Russian Federation, President of Ukraine, and President of the United States of America on the territory of Turkey is something like a trap for the President of the Russian Federation. It's a trap. It's a clear and a very, very simple trap for the Russians. First of all, we need to understand that despite the fact that the Russians proposed to start talks on the territory of Turkey, the Russians proposed to start talks between delegations, not between Putin himself. Another important thing, that Turkey is not something like Saudi Arabia. Turkey is not something like United Arab Emirates. The thing is that Turkey is a part of NATO. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are neutral states. Turkey is a part of NATO, and we know that since the beginning of the special military operation, NATO was behind Ukraine. NATO have supported Ukraine since the beginning of the special military operation. Now imagine yourself a meeting on the territory of a NATO country between the President of the Russian Federation, basically the President of enemy state for NATO, the President of the United States, and Ukraine itself on the territory of NATO country. It is very difficult to understand this complicated situation. Just imagine yourself, for example, 1944, and let's say the Germany during the Second World War in 1944 decided, let's say, to find a solution how to settle the conflict in the world peacefully. And imagine yourself, let's say that the leader of Soviet Union, Stalin, was, let's say, invited to the territory of Berlin for these peaceful talks. Imagine yourself and try to answer yourself whether it could be possible or not. Obviously, the answer is not. It is impossible. It is impossible that the President of the Russian Federation would go to the territory of Turkey on the territory of the NATO states with the purpose to start talks with Ukraine and the United States of America. First of all, it is very dangerous from the security perspective, and from the other side, we need to understand that this is something like a capitulation. You come to the state or to the territory of, let's say, your opponent in case if you want to surrender or if you have no other option but to do something like this. So obviously Russia will never accept this. They can accept talks between delegations, and then the Russians and the Ukrainians could sign some agreements on the territory of Saudi Arabia, but not the beginning of direct talks on the territory of the NATO state. Now let's return back to Ukraine. We have a lot of important updates, and first let's talk about the southern directions. If you remember, during the previous 24 hours and during the previous video, we were talking a lot about this concentration of Russian FPV drone attacks. And yesterday we came to conclusion that most likely the Russians were preparing for something. Most likely the Russians were planning to begin another offensive operation in this area with the purpose to establish control over additional territories around the settlement of Kamenska. We had lots of icons. We came to this conclusion, and by the morning of the 13th of May, several mappers adjusted their maps. For example, this is the situation once again by the end of the 12th of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 13th of May. As you can see, as a result of offensive operation that was carried out by the Russians, maybe not yesterday, but during the previous days, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take additional territories and to take under control most likely the gray zone between the settlement of Kamenska and the positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation. Very important attack from the Russian side. Most likely the Russians will continue. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. As you can see, we have lots of icons and we have probably the most important updates from this area. First, let's talk about the settlement of Bahatyr. From this area during the previous night, we got additional videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking this settlement. And I'll remind you that if you remember yesterday, we discussed that most likely yesterday we were talking like this, that this upcoming night would be probably the final and the decisive night for the armored force of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement, and most likely between the nights between the 3rd, 12th and the 13th of May, the Ukrainians would abandon their positions in this settlement. So these are the words and these are our talks yesterday during the previous video. And today several pro-Russian mappers updated that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Bahatyr. As for now, we haven't received anything from more or less reliable resources, let's say from neutral mappers or from pro-Ukrainian sources. And neither the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed this information. The only thing we have is small changes and adjustments on the perimeter of the settlement and probably in the southern part of the village. But once again, we are waiting for the Ministry of Defense. Of course, we are waiting for geolocations and videos that can be published by the soldiers on the ground. But of course, at the same time, we are going to keep this information in our minds that according to several pro-Russian resources, by the morning of the 13th of May of 2025, the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory. Most likely during the next probably day or two, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information as well. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours and during the previous night, the Russians improved their positions on their way towards the village of Kamar. As for the morning of the 13th of May of 2025, this information was confirmed just by pro-Russian and neutral resources, as for now also without any geolocations that can confirm this. So, for example, this is the situation by the end of the 12th of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 13th of May. The Russians managed to improve their position significantly. At the same time, the Russian sources published this video where we can see how Russian drones were flying above the settlement of Odradne and how the Russians were dropping different applications and different lists where they were trying to suggest and to propose Ukrainians to surrender and not to show any resistance during the battle for this settlement. We know that usually if the Russians began dropping such a kind of papers, this means that most likely the Russians are about to begin their major offensive operation in this area. So now we understand that Ukrainian defense in this area is about to collapse, and most likely the Russians will continue advancing further and the Russians are going to enter operational space, and most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to slow down the Russians or to stop the Russians in this area in the very near future. And telling the truth, this is another reason why the Russians need to start any talks, because now they're advancing along the line of combat contact, and this is the reason why Ukrainians wants the Russians to start negotiations and this 30-day unconditional ceasefire. The situation right now, as you can see, is very complicated, so let's wait and see what is going to be next. But I believe that the Russians can accept this 30-day ceasefire only in case if the United States of America America will cancel sanctions against Russia. But on the other side, even if the states cancel some sanctions against Russia, who can say and who can give the Russians guarantees that the United States of America will not resume their sanctions once again in 30 days. So the situation is very complicated, and as I understand right now, the Western countries are trying to find this key approach how to work with the Russians and how to talk with them. Let's talk about the Novopavlovka direction. As you can see, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. The Russians managed to take under control this pocket and to answer the villages of Novosergeyevka, Novonikolaevka. Furthermore, right before I pressed the button to start recording this video, we got first geolocation from the territory of Novomikolaevka. So now we have no doubts that the Russians have already answered the settlement and that the clashes are taking place for this area. If the Russians indeed answered the settlement of Novomikolaevka, we can say that the Russians approached and reached the border between Dnipro and Donetsk regions. Now let's talk about the city of Pakovsk. If you remember, yesterday we discussed this. According to several mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the area of Zverova. This information was provided by pro-Russian resources, and today this information was confirmed by neutral mappers. As you can see, the Russians continue advancing in the southwestern direction of the city of Pakovsk. At the same time, the Russians are trying to clear the road of attack from the southern direction in the direction of the villages of Novopavlovka and Gnatovka. In this video, we can see how the Russians were attacking positions along the railways of the armored forces of Ukraine with TOS flamethrower system. So we expect additional offensive operation on the ground in upcoming days or maybe even hours. Now let's talk about the Kiban Bixski pocket. We have lots of important updates, and first let's talk about Ukrainian company stronghold between the settlements of Berezovka, Novopoltavka and the settlement of Novalenovka. Today several pro-Russian resources, neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian sources adjusted their maps in this area. When talking about pro-Russian resources, they have colored this territory completely in Russian favor. When talking about pro-Ukrainian sources, as you can see, they have marked this territory as a contested area, which means that currently Ukrainians and pro-Ukrainian sources don't know for sure whether this area is still under complete Ukrainian control or maybe the Russians have already captured these territories. So as you can see, the situation in this area is also very difficult. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 12th of May, and now this is the situation by the beginning of the 13th of May. The Russians most likely took under control this stronghold, and now the Russians have no barriers and no problems to advance further in the western direction with the purpose to establish complete control over the settlement of Novopoltavka, and now the Russians can continue moving further in the northeastern direction along N32 road with the purpose to attack the city of Konstantinovka from the southwest. When talking about the most southern part of Kiban Bixski reservoir, we have another adjustment of map that was also provided by the neutral and by pro-Ukrainian sources. As you can see, Deep State confirmed that something is happening in this pocket. Most likely the Russians managed to answer this territory, and currently the Russians are trying to finish the clearing operation. Once again, this pocket used to be considered as a territory under complete Ukraine control, but now according to pro-Ukrainian sources, they have some doubts about the status of this territory, but telling the truth, most likely this pocket was already captured by the Russians, and now we see that the settlement of Stara Nikolaevka is already semi-encircled by the Russians from the southwest, from the south, from the southeast, from the east. Most likely the Russians will try to attack this settlement from the north with the purpose to outflank and to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area, otherwise the Ukrainians could be caught in cauldron. As for the city of Toretsk, we have several changes on the ground, as you can see. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Zabalka micro-district. In this area, we can see lots of episodes how Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers in this area. And one of the episodes, this is exactly the opposite we're talking about, was geolocated on the map. So Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers in this point. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. This territory used to be considered as a contested area. Now we have no doubts that there are Russian presence there. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the south in Diliivka. Once again, these adjustments on the map were made also based on the video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were bombing Russian positions in this area, and one of the episodes of this video took place exactly in this point. Based on this video we have adjusted the map, and we see that the news around the south in Diliivka is tightening. Most likely the Ukrainians in the very near future would be forced to fall back from this area with the purpose not to be caught in cauldron by the Russians. At the same time, the Russians established complete fire control over the main logistic roads between the south in Diliivka, the village of the south in Diliivka, and the city of Toretsk, which means that Ukrainians currently have huge problems with evacuation, rotation, and with additional supply and support of their contingent on the territory of this settlement. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Sever's direction. As for now, the Russians are trying to advance in the Serebryanka forest. During the previous day, we got a lot of very important videos from this area. The Russians began offensive operation on this territory with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back completely from this territory. Lots of artillery strikes, lots of attacks using the TSOS flamethrower systems. So the situation for Ukrainians is very complicated around the settlement of Grigorovka. I'll remind you that this is one of the areas where we can see one of the biggest dynamic of Russian offensive, and we see that the Russians are not going to stop. Now let's talk about the Liman direction. As we discussed in the previous videos, there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Ridkodub. The clashes has already begun, and we have video that can confirm this. In this video we can see how Russian soldier was fighting with Ukrainian drone that was trying to hit this soldier. Based on this video we came to conclusion that several episodes took place exactly on the most southeastern part of the settlement, and based on this video most of the mappers adjusted their maps. So we see that the Russians answered the settlement of Ridkodub, and despite the value of this village, despite the fact that Ukrainians during the previous days brought additional forces and units with the purpose to stabilize the situation, we see that the Russians managed to break the Ukrainian defense and answer this key region. If the Russians take this village under complete control, then the Russians will be able to continue offensive operation in the direction of the city of Liman and in the direction of the village by the name of Barova. When talking about the northern Kupiansk direction, no changes. When talking about the northern directions, the same situation. The Ukrainians stopped any attempts to answer the territory of the settlement of Tyotkina. Now the Ukrainians basically can't even cross the border. The Ukrainians try to concentrate their forces along the border, but the Russians established complete control over this territory with drones, and as soon as the Russians see any movement in this area, the Russians try to destroy it as soon as and as fast as possible. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.